This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. Let's go to the spring of 1964, when the state of New Hampshire finally passes a bill to reinstate the lottery. New Hampshire Governor John W. King was the first one to buy a ticket from the new lottery system. It was $3. And guess what? Governor John King ended up winning $7.8 million and retiring from office to go hang out on his yacht in the Caribbean. Okay, that part didn't happen. King did not win, but the lottery was here to stay. And now, of course, all but 3 states have a lottery system. It is largely used to fund education departments and other government services, and it's a real cultural and economic force, especially now in 2025, where it's not just lotto and scratch-offs, but we have the meteoric rise of sports gambling and casinos and lots more. So let's go back to the humble roots of the scratch and win industrial complex. Back with us on the show is the great Ian Coss, the host and producer of a new series called Scratch and Win, which is from GBH News. Ian has done a lot of work with our friends at PRX and GBH in Boston. His last series was that remarkable series on The Big Dig, which he was on to talk about when that came out. But here he's back. Ian, congrats on the new series. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
You start your series inside a bodega. I guess they don't call them bodegas in Boston, but you start your series inside a bodega where someone's buying scratch-offs.
We call it a packy.
Yeah, there you go. But here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hey there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So yeah, I want you to get us into the sort of world of the, what did you say, the packy?
Mm-hmm. The packy.
Oh,
the convenience store.
I don't think I knew that.
Not a bodega, though.
The package store, Jody.
The package store, right, yeah. So I want you to get us into sort of how ubiquitous scratch-offs and lotto are right now, which is the sort of crux of your series. But, you know, in that intro, I mentioned that lotto had been gone for a while and then it got brought back. Do you have the history of, like, why lotto was not a thing and then and why 1963 was the year in which it finally passed in New Hampshire, of all places?
Yeah, for sure. Gambling is this funny thing in America where it's like a pendulum. We get into it, and then we kind of claw it back, and then we get into it. So if you go back to the colonial era, there were lotteries back then that helped fund, like, you know, the Army during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army. When Harvard and Yale started up, they ran lotteries to fund the construction of dorms, okay? So this was something that was just in, you know, part of the culture back then. And then you get these periods of religious revival in the United States that also sort of come in waves. And so in the early 1800s, the lotteries, a lot of them get outlawed. Later in the 1800s, they start to come back, partly to fund the Civil War and other enterprises. Then in the late 1800s, they get banned again. So one historian who's written about this describes sort of like 3 discrete eras of lotteries in America. There's one in the colonial era, one in the 1800s, and then it really goes underground for a while. And when I say underground, I mean literally like illegal, right? There were no legal lotteries from about the 1890s on until 1964. When New Hampshire sort of revives this practice and creates the modern state lottery. And the pressures at that point are the things that you might expect. States needed money, right? And of course, New Hampshire it makes sense as the first state out of the gate, famously tax-averse state. They were at that moment in kind of a fiscal crunch and considering, gasp, a sales tax. No. The unthinkable. Okay, sales tax, perhaps, you know, maybe a property tax increase. And so in that moment, this idea of a state-run lottery that could, you know, replace a sales tax or keep that, you know, off the table became politically feasible, even though all that, you know, the cultural baggage, the stigma around gambling, all that was still in the air. But the money piece really pushed it over the line.
Mm-hmm. And it seems like that combination of the need for these northeastern states in particular to start raising some money since they're losing their tax base as deindustrialization picks up, but also like a changing set of mores in society, right? Like a lot of those earlier restrictions are starting to ease. You're starting to move into a kind of more secular direction. And so people are revisiting some of those religiously rooted laws and restrictions. And so it does seem like kind of a moment ripe for the return of the lottery, especially as you get into it. I feel like the 70s is especially a moment when it's going to flourish, and New Hampshire makes a lot of sense as the place where the anti-tax sentiment helps spur it along a little more quickly.
Yeah, it makes sense that New Hampshire's at the front of that.
Yeah. One of the cultural pieces of it that I found just so fascinating and unexpected was that if you look at the first generation of lottery states, which is basically the Northeast, as far south as Maryland, as far west as Michigan, they're all heavily Catholic states. And so that is part of the cultural demographic transition that makes it possible. You think of New England, you think Puritans, but by the 1970s, Massachusetts or Rhode Island, these places are not run by Puritans. They're run by Irish Catholics. And historically, Catholics have always been more tolerant of gambling than Protestants.
And other vices.
Think about like church hall bingo and other vices. Yeah, it's interesting how in that moment, it's both the financial piece is changing, the cultural piece, the religious. There are all these kind of forces coming together to make gambling more palatable.
Yeah, when you mentioned Catholics, and I was raised German Catholic, it was Catholics during Prohibition who were being targeted because they were like, actually, we like to drink. We're not really into the whole abstinence around alcohol thing, and so it makes sense. There's just like a different culture around different normative behaviors. So that's a really interesting demographic transition.
Like, Jesus turned water into wine. Yeah,
right. And maybe he rolled the dice a little. It's fine.
Did he play the numbers?
Well, there's the whole idea of drawing lots, which goes back to the Bible. That's a lottery,
What were the actual very first games? I'm assuming they weren't your scratch-offs. What were they? Were they?
Yeah, not at all. So if we talk about the New Hampshire lottery was actually called the New Hampshire Sweepstakes. And that is key because the game was confusingly based on horse racing. And this ties in with some of those, old laws that were still on the books that, were trying to outlaw lotteries. There were all these laws in place about like transporting certain kinds of gambling paraphernalia or what you could bet on. And so New Hampshire, they basically studied the laws that were on the books to try and figure out what they could get away with doing within their own state borders without breaking the law. And what they came up with was this very elaborate game in which on March 12th, this day, as you said, tickets went on sale. Those tickets were not actually lottery tickets. What they were is they all went in a drum, and 3 months later, in July, the governor of the state and, with much fanfare, drew out of that drum tickets. Those tickets were not winners. Those tickets were then matched with horses that would then race. The horse race, however, was in September. Okay, so now we've gone from March to July to September. The people whose tickets matched with horses that wound up running in the race, then they waited to see if the horse won. If it won, they won the lottery.
My God.
So it was truly a 6-month process. That is
crazy.
The original lottery. It's insane.
Right.
And you compare that to, scratch tickets, numbers games, betting on your phone. It's really a world away. And so much of the story that we really tell in the podcast is sort of how we get from a 6-month horse race based drawing to instant gratification in the palm of your hand, which happens pretty quickly, over the course of the 60s and 70s.
I wonder, though, can you talk about in that moment when it's like this long delay, like how much money are they raising? Like, I can't imagine that they're raising a ton of money at the start of this process.
So that first year, the state sold just under $6 million worth of tickets. Again, those were $3 tickets, which was less than what they're hoping to get. And that first year, I believe, was their best year. It sort of declined after the interest in it declined. And so the New Hampshire lottery was successful in the sense of proving that this was possible, that the public would accept it, and that it wouldn't instantly be infiltrated and taken over by the mob. But it was not wildly successful as like entertainment.
Right.
Yeah.
And so pretty quickly, New York, which is the second lottery state, New Jersey, which is the third, and then Massachusetts, which is the fourth. Those are the states that really start to innovate and make bigger payoffs, faster turnaround time, more advertising, more accessibility. That's what really creates a modern lottery that we would recognize.
Can I ask, was $3 considered a lot of money to pay for something like this? I mean, I think about like how much I would pay for a scratch-off ticket now, and not a lot. I wouldn't pay anything, but but $3 seems a little high in the 60s for paying for that.
I mean, so we get to this later in the series, but there are now $50 scratch tickets.
There's no way I would pay that. There's no way. That's throwing away money.
There are many, many people who buy $50 lottery tickets, scratch tickets every day.
Wow.
But however, to answer your question, at that time in 1964, it was a lot of money, especially when you compare it to the primary competition for state lotteries. And this is really what drives a lot of the innovation. The competition was illegal numbers games. So we get into this later in the series. The Numbers was this game that grew out of Harlem in the 1920s, became wildly popular, especially in the Northeast and the Rust Belt. And a typical numbers game bet would be, a nickel, a dime, a quarter. It was a way for, everyday working people to just put a little of their money on this slim chance that they could get, money that would really transform their lives. And so when you compare, that daily rhythm, I'll bet a number, bet a nickel on my number, to am I going to buy a $3 ticket that I have to wait 6 months for a possible payout on, you can see why it didn't have the same appeal.
Before we get going with today's show, I want to give a shout out to another show in the Radiotopia family, Radio Diaries. For over 25 years, Radio Diaries has been creating sound-rich personal stories on history and beyond, and now they have a new mini-series. It's called Making Waves. This series is right up my alley. It is stories about 3 controversial broadcasters in American history, who each used their microphone in different ways. One to warn, one to rile, and one to preach. And today, they are largely forgotten. There's a black preacher who reached millions on the airwaves before the civil rights movement, a woman who tried to warn the public of Hitler's rising power, and the talk show host who first proved that outrage sells.
Sometimes we get people on there who disagreed with him and would fight with him. Actually, he liked that.
I mean, if you were a Broadway play, you'd be a flop.
I'm not a Broadway play.
But you're a flop.
You can listen to all 3 episodes of Making Waves on the Radio Diaries podcast and find out lots more at radiodiaries.org. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Let's take a moment to talk about your wireless bill. Maybe you, like me, take a look at that bill every month and get a little shudder that goes down your spine, and you ask yourself, how can it cost so much to get wireless service? But guess what? It really doesn't have to be that way. You can say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan's jaw-dropping monthly bills and unexpected overages, because Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans that start at $15 a month. All of their plans come with high-speed data, unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone, you can transfer over. I made the switch from one of the major carriers recently. It was incredibly seamless. And just like that, it was like, I really didn't have to be paying that much all these years. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is here for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Upfront payments of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. This episode is brought to you by Quince. Folks, it is officially time to start thinking about refreshing your wardrobe for the spring, maybe even leveling up with a little affordable luxury. Well, Quince is here to help. Quince offers a range of high-quality items at prices within reach. I'll tell you the section of Quince that I'm most excited about, which might tell you something about where my head's at. There's a section on the site called The Vacation Shop. I just ordered a new pair of sunglasses from there. They have an Italian leather sling for under $100, hats, cases, even luggage if you want. I have made a vow to travel in linen and only linen, so I've stocked up on a couple European utility shirts, $45, that's it. And a new pair of nice-looking board shorts, $40. So I am all set for my summer travels. If you've got your eye on all the fun that comes with warm weather, go ahead and give Quince a shot. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping, 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday. So can I ask you about the larger revenue story here? You talked about how New Hampshire, it didn't hit their initial expectation. Other states perfect the kind of game of it. But does it actually drive real revenue for states? Are there states that are kind of really relying on this in a real way?
Yes and no. So when you move on to New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, those early states, they had very high expectations for their lottery revenue, like New Hampshire. And it's interesting. You can find, as the states are debating these measures, there's this idea that it's going to be a panacea. It's like the Philosopher's Stone or something. You'll just be able to have it all, and it never really is that. Partly because, there's still a lot of illegal gambling going on, and there was just never going to be a replacement for taxes. And so what you see over the course of, as lotteries spread, I mentioned they start in the Northeast, they spread to the Midwest and the West next, and then eventually to the South, which if you think about is sort of like the really evangelical center, that was sort of the last place to embrace it. As lotteries spread, the ambitions for them get more and more narrow, which is why by the time you get to, say, the Georgia State Lottery, it's no longer something that just goes into the general fund or funds schools statewide. It funds a specific college scholarship.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so, whereas in Massachusetts, lottery revenue takes the form of unrestricted local aid to cities and towns. It was like, this is a way to fund cities and towns instead of property taxes. The reality, like I said, it was never going to replace property taxes, but it can fund a college scholarship. And that's sort of the shift you see over time, is this recognition that, yes, it's really appealing revenue, again, because it's not a tax, but it's not that significant in terms of, the bigger picture of state revenue.
This is such a fascinating topic because I'm not anti-gambling, although it's not something that I'm particularly interested in myself. But there seems to be something quite pernicious about this way of legitimizing gambling for the broader public, right? That first of all, it's attached to a virtue. So now you don't have to worry about it as a vice. This is how we're funding schools. You're doing something good for society, which is one part of it. And then there's another pernicious layer behind it, which is we don't need to tax you. People can just voluntarily pay in. Yeah. This is great. It solves all of our problems. And it begins to weaken what was already a weakening part of the social contract, which is schools are good and we should pay for them. And actually, we should pay for them based on how much money we make, as opposed to, especially as the lottery gets more advanced and you can get these less expensive lottery tickets, or you have things like Atlantic City opening, it becomes a kind of poor tax because as people find less security in jobs in the social safety net, of course they're going to gamble because it's the only option they have for trying to figure a way out of the hole that inequality has put them in.
There's this kind of tension where like you said, if you think of the lottery as a tax, it's a very regressive tax. In terms of, the heaviest players tend to be lower income, working poor. Advocates of the lottery will say, well, it's not really a tax. It's a game. It's entertainment. It's something people want anyway. It's their choice. And so there is that tension where, like, on the one hand, it's held up as this is voluntary revenue. On the other hand, it's held up as, well, it's not really a tax. It's a game. And it's hard to have it both ways.
Well, and it's on the list of, maybe at the top of the list of, like, when people from other countries look at the U.S. and they say, you fund your schools how? And it's like through property tax and lotteries, and it's like
local property taxes and state lotteries.
And I gather the UK, the National Lottery does fund some education initiatives, and in Canada a little bit, but like Finland, Sweden, Germany, Japan, France, like they just do proper taxes to fund their schools. And it is just kind of a reminder of like how kind of strange and Rube Goldbergian we have set things up to fund our schools.
And I would add to to bring it up to the present moment too, that same playbook is used around sports betting now. So for example, when Colorado launched its big sports betting rollout, which I think was in 2019, right very soon after the Supreme Court kind of opened the door for widespread sports betting, it was tied to water funding. Part of the whole selling package was sports betting is going to fund this huge investment in like water conservation and infrastructure. And in many ways, part of the reason I think the story of lotteries is so important is it kind of whet the appetite for this painless revenue. And that's why you see the expansion of casino gambling and the expansion of sports betting, all these things that kind of build on, well, where else can we squeeze some money?
Yeah. And I do feel like I find this endlessly fascinating because the rise of sports gambling is something that I've been paying attention to because I feel like it's immiserating like an entire generation of men who are losing their money through it, but who are also enjoying it, right? Like it seems like something that people spend a lot of time thinking about and engaging in, and it's a new way of interacting with sports. But it also strikes me that as the economy becomes more of a gamble, right? When there's not a clear path for anyone to make money. Like, oh, you get to be an influencer. Maybe you'll win there. Maybe you'll win in the gig economy. You won't win in the gig economy. But like this too, it feels more legitimate because it's no more of a crapshoot than going to college and trying to get a job and having a career. Right. So I feel like it's not just like interesting of its own right, but it is also interesting as like a signal of something much bigger that's happening in the economy and in just people's hope for the future and their ability to sort of see a path forward for their lives.
But is it just me? Like, I have been to Vegas and played the tables, and when I lost $40, I was like demoralized for the rest of the day. Like, I was like about $40, but like I was like, wait. They took my money, like I needed that. Like I didn't get any gratification, and I'm sure there's the dopamine rush you get when even if you win like $1 or whatever. I guess I never understood because the stakes are stacked so high against you, because the probability of you winning feels so low or so out of reach. It never felt alluring to me, I guess, in that way. But when you see these numbers, I mean, especially today, like 2010, the lottery nationwide brings in $62.85 billion. Like these are massive numbers. Like these are like greater than the GDPs of some countries. And you're wondering, like, how do people get themselves to keep betting on a system that they are not ever really going to benefit from?
Part of what's tricky policy-wise is that for most people, which sounds like includes you, Kellie, they can gamble responsibly and it's not a problem. And there is, this gets into all kinds of factors, but for some people, it is a compulsion and an addiction. And, I spend some time with folks in the series who will, go into a convenience store on their lunch break and spend $500 on scratch tickets.
What?
And just like Nicole was saying about sports betting today, for some people, it is a truly overpowering compulsion.
Yeah.
Part of what's so interesting now is, like Nicole, like you were saying, there's this real blurring over what is gambling and what isn't. And, when lotteries were starting, it was like a hard, bright line, a moral line. And now it is sort of seeped into everything. Like, is crypto gambling? Is fantasy sports gambling? Is buying a meme stock gambling? Prediction markets, like you say, going to college, is that,
Really?
In some ways, this gambling is kind of diffused in our society. Everything's a gamble.
I'm curious having spent so much time in this world and talking to actual people who gamble a lot and gamble casually, I think this is one of the fundamental questions. Does the system need those quote unquote problem gamblers in order to actually turn a profit and survive?
Yes.
And, and maybe...
And that's true of sports betting too.
Yeah. And so, if you have a system that is just like predicated on the fact that there is going to be some real dire consequences for the numbers to shake out, what do we do with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a classic kind of 80-20 setup where, the majority of the revenue comes from a small percentage of the users. And so without those, really heavy users, the revenue base is not there. And I think especially when the state is the house, it creates this very odd set of incentives. And you'll see the state kind of playing both sides of it, where last year in 2024, literally in the same, I believe it was the same legislative session, Massachusetts approved online lottery sales for the first time ever. So you can buy scratch tickets, numbers games online. And in the same session, approved this whole pot of money to combat youth problem gambling. And of course, the reason you sell lottery tickets online is to reach younger players. And so there are all these efforts where, like, some of the lottery money will get put back into mitigation towards problem gambling. But it's just it's a little confusing when the state has this really entrenched interest to drive lottery revenue, but also in theory to protect its, vulnerable populations. And those things get very messy.
Sounds like the cigarette industry. You know what I mean?
Or the prison, industry.
Except run by the state.
Yes. All of the above.
And, some people say, there are state-run liquor stores in many states. Not where I live, but across the border in New Hampshire. And that's a similar thing where, alcohol kills a lot more people than lotteries. And, if you have state-run liquor stores, the state is invested in people buying liquor. So it's not unique to gambling, but it's very strange when you really stop and think about how deeply enmeshed state government is in this activity that for centuries, humans have considered a kind of vice.
So you said if you stop and think about it, it's very strange. Well, luckily, people can stop and think about it in a 7-part series, which you have just put out. So there's a lot of thinking about it in the new series. It's called Scratch and Win. It's from GBH News. Ian Coss is the reporter and host of it. I guess I should ask you, I guess every interview you're going to do about this is going to ask you this, but I'll ask it. Have you done, did you go and buy a scratch off from time to time, or do you play the Lotto, and has that changed?
So I grew up playing scratch tickets. This is one thing I didn't, growing up in Massachusetts, I didn't realize just how a thing scratch tickets are in Massachusetts relative to other places. But it was something like my mom would pick up, when we stopped for gas, we would go to my stepdad's house for Easter and we would get scratch tickets as part of the egg hunt.
We'd get them in our stockings
for scratch tickets.
We still do.
What?
Exactly. It really is that kind of thing. And I still, when we launched the series, I bought a whole bunch of scratch tickets and gave them out to everybody at GBH who had worked on it. And there's some of the folks who were not from Massachusetts were like, "What? I don't even know how to do this." So I still enjoy it from time to time. But I will say the thing that has changed for me is I just notice it. Because it is one of those things, state lotteries, they can easily kind of just recede into the urban background. But if you start looking for the Mega Millions jackpot number in the window of the convenience store, the ad on the back of the bus, the scratch tickets littered on the sidewalk, the number slips, that guy standing in the corner, who's not there to buy milk and eggs, but is just there. Once you start looking for it, you really notice it.
All right.
That's what's changed for me.
No, for sure. All right. Well, we really encourage people to go listen to the series, and congratulations again. But Ian, thanks for doing this.
Awesome. Thank you.
Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.